Hello there. Are you a previously beloved, problematic figure caught up in a controversy? Did you get caught doing ableism? Are you getting criticism that you don't want to reflect on? Well, let me introduce you to a new product that is all the rage. Autism shields. Can these shields protect you from getting autism? No, of course not. We all know autism is in the water you drink. But if you're getting criticism, all you have to do is put on your autism shield. Hey, what you did was racist. I'm autistic. We don't understand racism. Hey, you created a film that perpetuates and capitalizes off of the abuse of autistic people. No, you don't understand. I'm on the autism scale myself, so it's not ableist. Hey, you allegedly groomed and essayed someone. Yeah, so let's talk about Neil Gaiman and Death of the Author. But before we get into all of that, hi there, my name is Rebecca, or Ricky Faith Quinn. I'm an autism advocate and crisis counselor for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. But do not be fooled by that. I am what is known as an autistic bimbo, because I'm all beauty and no brains. Or in autistic language, I'm all beauty and no trains. Come on guys, if you don't laugh, it's sad. If you would like to join the bimboification of autism and feminism, be sure to take a look at our Patreon or YouTube memberships via the links down below. But if you're a broke fish like me, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, because if you don't, the subscribe button will think you don't love him. Second, I just want to add a trigger warning. This video will contain discussions of racism, transphobia, misogyny, and accusations of grooming and sexual assault. As always, if any of these topics trigger you, please do not hesitate to stop the video and contact the crisis hotlines down below, where crisis counselors like myself will support you. You do not have to go through this alone, and please do not hesitate to reach out. With all that said, let's get into it. So when I say Death of the Author, what do I mean? I mean, get the Jewish space laser, ready, aim, and fire! No, I'm just kidding. It's not my turn with the space laser. They took my keys away after I kept trying to vaporize Andrew Tate. When I talk about Death of the Author, I'm talking about a literary concept, one that originated way back in 1967 in an essay by French literary critic and theorist Roland Barthes. I apologize for my terrible pronunciation, titled Le Mort de l'Auteur, or, in bimbo terms, Death of the Author. I'm going to summarize a somewhat complicated concept here overly. The gist of Death of the Author states that the author's context doesn't matter much when interpreting the text, but rather the context of the reader's life. An entertaining and recent example of the online discourse of Death of the Author is a term called cornplating, which is a very new meme turned pop culture media shorthand to describe when people pick through tiny details to try and find meaningful subtext behind them. For an absolutely excellent in-depth look into cornplating, please go and watch Milo on the TikTok Pretending to be Hot. They have a fantastic breakdown on it. As Milo points out in their video on cornplating, the discussion over whether or not people are being overly analytical of media or not analytical enough, whether they realize this or not, people on both sides are having discussions of Death of the Author and how much authorial intent matters. Does it matter if the creators of Encanto were trying to say something significant with Dolores holding up a plate of corn? I don't know, probably not. You'd have to ask them. But if they weren't trying to say something, does it matter that the Twitter user Hourly Dolores interpreted it to have meaning when they posted this meme? I don't know, probably. It means something to Hourly Dolores. Maybe their whole family was cursed for always and eternity because of their no good, dirty, rotten, corn-stealing great-great-grandfather. Here's the thing about Death of the Author. The question is not which matters more, reader interpretation or authorial intent, because the answer is both. They both matter relatively equally. So when it comes to Death of the Author, it's important to note that the art creator does not solely own art, but it is not exclusively the property of the art consumer. Though somebody will always interpret the work at least slightly differently than the author intended, solely due to the reader bringing in their own biases when it comes to the interpretation, the work will also never be completely free from the author itself. There are still always going to be the author's biases and baked-in opinions in there to inform you in some way of how to interpret the work. So when I find out that my favorite artist has turned out to be a terrible human being, how do I apply Death of the Author? Or rather, does it apply at all? Here's my own opinion how I use it regarding the works of problematic authors. You do not have to follow my methods. Remember, I'm a bimbo, so I'm sharking stupid. Back in my youth, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, Harry Potter was integral to my development, as it was to many of us millennials. Millennials as a generation watched multiple on-screen tragedies and mass unaliving events broadcast on live television before most of us got our first training bra, so of course we all went into fantasy escapism as a coping skill. Given the desire for this escapism, it's no wonder we all attached ourselves to Harry Potter. In this world, 9/11 hadn't happened. It was okay to be weird, and if you're the annoying smart girl in class, you're really what keeps the whole shebang together. Of course, getting none of the credit in the end. Because feminism. With all that love from lonely millennials, who apparently were a vast untapped market, Harry Potter became the best-selling book series in history, selling more than 600 million copies worldwide, only 200 copies less than the Bible. Harry Potter was a cultural phenomenon and became a pop culture staple, spanning 2 massive film franchises, a successful in-theme world from Universal Studios, a Broadway play, and an upcoming reimagining of the books through an HBO TV series. I seriously cannot understate how massive the success of Harry Potter was and how much it solidified itself into the identities of those of us who consumed it. So, when it came out that J.K. Rowling was a massive TERF, it was a devastating blow for so many fans, especially those of us in the LGBTQ community, for whom we had found a sense of safety within this world. At the time when all of this went down, everyone started crying out, "Separate art from the artist!" And there were content creators everywhere who were advocating for how you could ethically continue to consume Harry Potter content, support it by buying secondhand, don't contribute to Joe's pocket, but still consume the product. And listen, as an autistic person, I completely understand the aversion to change, especially when, for a lot of autistic people, in particular, Harry Potter was also a special interest of theirs. So many of the fans clung to the idea that J.K. Rowling's bigotry was completely separate from Harry Potter as a franchise and as a whole, and that it existed despite her bigotry and not because of it. But, in actuality, the bigotry was always there. Always. And in more ways than just transphobia. Despite the series supposedly being an allegory for bigotry being wrong, the series goes out of its way to emphasize that while discriminating against Muggleborns is terrible, it's still totally cool to enslave house elves because they like it. They're happy slaves. When Winky is freed in the books, she becomes a depressed drunk who sells out the good guys to the allegorical wizard Yahtzees. All because she was sad to be freed from slavery. And also, it's apparently bizarre that Hermione wants them to have equal rights. We should make fun of her for wanting that. Not like the discrimination she faces as a Muggleborn informs her opinion in any way. There's a lot of racism in the books. Like, an enormous amount of racism. The only prominent black characters in Hogwarts, Dean Thomas and Lee Jordan, both have only single mothers with fathers who abandoned them before they were born. The only other prominent black character, Kingsley Shacklebolt, is a black man who wears African clothing, and his name is literally Kingsley Shacklebolt. But don't worry, this plays into a theme of racist names, like Cho Chang, a name made up of 2 last names. Or Seamus Finnegan, the only prominent Irish character, also spends his time trying to turn water into rum and is terrible at everything except blowing things up. Or Padme and Pavarti Patil, the most generic names for the only 2 Indian characters in the book. God, if Jo had Jewish characters in the books, she probably would have named them like Harry Goldstein, the son of a banker. Oh wait, she sort of already did that. The goblins depicted in the Harry Potter series are inherently anti-Semitic caricatures, being conniving, hooked-nosed, big-eared creatures obsessed with money and controlling all of the world. They're trickster creatures who will totally backstab you even after you saved their life, all to get the gold shiny thing you have. You may be saying to yourself, that's not fair, that's just goblin lore. Well, yeah, you're right. And much of what we associate as original goblin lore is centuries-old anti-Semitism, because I don't know if you realize, but history hasn't exactly loved us Jews. Jo could have chosen not to lean into this trope, but instead leaned in hard. In the expanded universe of Hogwarts, A Legacy, the goblins also engage in a little bit of blood libel, where they steal wizard children to gain their powers to try and do an uprising. Just like that last one that they did, which happens to have taken place in a damn near the same year as an actual campaign of violence against Jewish people in Frankfurt. Like, at that point, it's not subtext. That's just text. So if this video is titled, Neil Gaiman, You're Dead to Me, why the shark did I just spend a million minutes talking about J.K. Rowling? Am I filled with so much internalized misogyny that I'm going to hold Jo accountable for Neil's alleged crimes? No, You see, the reason I just spent a million years discussing the many criticisms of Harry Potter text is an example of why you cannot entirely separate art from the artist. No matter what, there will always be hints that you may not have picked up on when first examining the text. But, to be fair, what about someone I can apply a certain level of separation of art from the artist? Well, let's talk a little bit Five Nights at Freddy's. No, I am not going into the FNAF timeline. MatPat spent enough grueling hours doing so, making him quit YouTube. I'm a bimbo, I don't have that kind of brain space. Five Nights at Freddy's started as an indie horror series in 2014, but has since launched into a hugely massive franchise spanning multiple book series, a series of AAA games, a film adaptation starring my arch nemesis Matthew Lillard.
I always come back.
And even a cookbook. Yes, I have the copy of the cookbook because of course I do. Five Nights at Freddy's was supposed to be the swan song of its creator, Scott Cawthon, who had been in the indie game development scene for a while with limited success. In 2014, despite having a reputation as a developer of Christianity-themed games, he released the first game of what would spawn one of the most massive franchises seen in indie gaming history. The game series not only solidified him as a game developer, but arguably solidified the YouTube careers of Dawko, Game Theory, and my personal favorite, Markiplier, who even attests that his $4 million home in Los Angeles is, in his words, the house that FNAF paid for. Like Harry Potter, Five Nights at Freddy's became a safe space for escapism, this time primarily for Gen Z and the occasional young millennial such as myself. FNAF's fanbase also had a considerable overlap with the LGBTQ community for reasons I can't explain. I don't know, man. I think maybe it's because Mangle was the representation we needed all along. Scott Cawthon seemed to understand that members of the LGBTQ community were flocking to the game, and instead of questioning or wondering why, he embraced it, including our humor and memes into the games. Like when fans asked him as to Mangle's gender, he simply responded, yes. Scott continued to provide a feeling of safety for his LGBTQ fans by donating to various charities for communities throughout the years. But then, as per usual, 2020 ruined everything. 2020 somehow, despite the pandemic, the isolation, my first time being homeless, and the most nerve-wracking election that I've witnessed so far, it still only stands in second place for the worst year of my life. But for many of us, we watched the election of 2020 between candidates Joe Biden and then President Donald Trump, knowing that this was likely a turning point for our country. Were we going to go further into a descent into rising fascism and a potential Donald Trump dictatorship? Or were we going to find some hope and normalcy in the possible presidency of former Vice President Joe Biden? Well, as we saw in a race that really shouldn't have been as close as it was, given one of the candidates is Donald Sharking Trump, the country voted against the human Cheeto and chose the now President Joe Biden. Those of us in favor of, well, I don't want to say Joe Biden, but rather anyone but Trump, breathed a sigh of relief, and those of us in the fandom returned to enjoying our little horror Chuck E. Cheese game. But in a world where people desperately want to know what, or rather who, our favorite artists are supporting, some fans began digging into Scott's finances and found that despite donating to so many LGBTQ charities, he also contributed $30,000 to the re-election campaign of the human Cheeto, and also some to the demon in human skin, Mitch McConnell. For a lot of us, this was a walking contradiction, given both Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell not only publicly hold very bigoted and anti-LGBTQ views, but have also contributed to several actions that have stripped LGBTQ people of protection of our rights, such as the blocking of the Equality Act, which would have solidified protections against discrimination for LGBTQ people across the board, and also voting against the Respect for Marriage Act, which would have codified marriage equality, which thankfully passed anyways, despite their attempts to block it. So with all of that, do I still hold the same opinion on Scott Cawthon as I do J.K. Rowling? Not really. While I don't believe art can ever fully be separated from the artist, the key differences are as follows. Scott's politics, horrible as they are not baked into the work the same way they are with Harry Potter. Despite his pro-life Christian and Republican beliefs, there are no Christian, pro-life, or Republican undertones of Five Nights at Freddy's. The animatronics aren't secret representations of Democrats coming for children. They're based on old wives' tales of children going missing in Chuck E. Cheese mazes, rumors of haunted locations, and reports of strange odors coming from animatronics. This might not be immediately understood by younger fans of the franchise, given the downfall of Chuck E. Cheese after the rise in in-home and game stations in the early 2000s, But still, for those of us dinosaurs who were kids in the 90s, or even the animated corpses of those who were kids in the 80s, we remember these urban legends because we were there. Scott didn't gaslight his fanbase. Despite J.K. Rowling's accusations that people were arguing against common sense, a logical fallacy known as the appeal to common sense fallacy, no one was arguing that. No one was arguing that sex and gender don't exist. Trans people and supporters of trans people like myself understand that there is not only a difference between sex and gender, with gender being the identity within oneself and sex being the physical aspect, but we also understand that sex is more than just a binary of male or female. Several different chromosomal combinations make a person intersex, many of which people don't even think to test for because their gender identity aligns with the sex assigned at birth. Joanne was arguing against a point that was never made, another fallacy known as a straw man fallacy. With Scott's support of Republican candidates, he acknowledged what he did and why. In his response on Reddit, Scott stated that he's not, in fact, homophobic or anti-LGBTQ, but he believes that LGBTQ people would have fared far worse under a Democratic candidate. He's wrong. He's so very, very wrong. In my opinion, as a former Christian and former Republican, this may stem from intense levels of indoctrination that comes with specific anti-LGBTQ and Republican churches. This does not represent all Christians nor even all Republicans, but there are far too many of them who are far too clam loud. And that propaganda has an effect. Scott stepped away from the creative aspects of FNAF. So even though his political and religious views aren't baked into the original lore that he had a hand in, there's no way to bake them in the future. Are we starting to see the difference here? For me, death of the author applies when there are few aspects of the author's biases baked into the text. But let's bring it to the authorial autopsy in question, Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is an author known for novels such as American Gods, Coraline, and Stardust. He's also known for comic series such as Sandman, which was later adapted into a Netflix original series, or Marvel 1602, where he reimagined Marvel superheroes in the Elizabethan era. For a long time, Gaiman was regarded as an accomplished and talented writer and a safe space for many. His dark tales gave many a sense of escapism and healing, and he's historically been a fierce advocate for LGBTQ rights and, ironically enough, feminism. That marvelous reputation, however, has come to a severe halt after several months ago it became public knowledge that two women, Scarlett Kensington and the second, who chooses only to be identified as Kay, came forward against him with accusations of sexual assault. Now, for legal purposes, the following stories are alleged. However, as a crisis counselor for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, I am inclined to believe victims whenever they come forward with accusations of assault. And also, trigger warning from here on out about SA. Kay, again, allegedly, met Niel at a book signing in 2003 where the two hit it off and began a relationship. There was a slight problem, though. At the time, Niel was in his 40s and she was in her 20s. As we've talked about on this channel before, that level of age gap brings a massive imbalance of power, with one person being broadly experienced and the younger person being inexperienced, likely not having the ability to understand the long-term impacts of these relationships. Kay alleges that on multiple occasions during their relationship, Niel engaged in rough and degrading sexual relations or full-on non-consensual sex. Kay also alleges that in one particular incident, she told him that she didn't want to have S due to a UTI, and he proceeded to do it anyway. This is sexual assault. If you say no to anything and they do it anyway, that is a violation of consent and is legally defined as sexual assault. Before you ask, if all of this happened in 2003, why is she just coming forward now? Let's remember two things. One, as we've established before, Neil Gaiman had significant power as an acclaimed author, novelist, and as a staunch feminist. She likely would have risked not being believed. And two, victims are allowed to come forward at any time for any reason. Point blank, period. Though a lot of time passed, Kay would not wind up being alone in her allegations, as in 2022, Neil would be accused of sexual assault again, this time by a woman named Scarlett Kensington. Scarlett alleges that on the day she started her employment as a nanny to Neil's child, he sexually assaulted her in a bathtub. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last time that Neil assaulted her, as similarly to Kay, during their 3-week consensual relationship, Neil subjected her to rough and degrading S. some of which Scarlett described as so painful that she lost consciousness. None of the incidents described should be used as a means of spreading anti-BDSM kink misinformation, by the way. There is absolutely nothing wrong with consensual BDSM, and as long as you engage in it responsibly, you're fine. I mean, of course some of us have a thing for dominant men. We're autistic and they're direct with what they want. But the acts that Niel has been accused of are not consensual, and never can be, because he had significant power over both of them, with Kay being a fan of his, and Scarlett being his employee, and both women being in their 20s at the time of the acts. And with consensual BDSM, both parties are allowed to say no at any time. And if it goes too far, you stop. Immediately. So, knowing what Niel has been accused of, can we apply Death of the Author to Neil Gaiman? Honestly, the answer is no. Not only is what Neil Gaiman accused of utterly vile and unforgivable, but if we look at the things he's written, it's apparent within the text that he knew these acts were wrong. In every sense of the word. He f***ing knew.
You f***ing knew!
Even before the accusations came forward against Neil Gaiman, the question of sexual violence had been discussed within his works. His comic book, The Sandman, has multiple discussions of sexual assault, including assault done against the character of Unity Kincaid while she's asleep, something that Kay also accuses Gaiman of doing against her. Though, unlike Unity, Kay was not impregnated against her will. There's also an implied sexual assault of Rose Walker's mother by her father. And in his novel, Anansi Boys, a character experiences an attempted sexual assault by a supernatural entity. And even American Gods includes incidents such as the description of sexual assault of an enslaved woman, and also Bilqui consuming men through her lady bits. That gives the movie Teeth a whole new meaning. The themes aren't just in Neil's comics or novels either. In his short story, Snow, Glass, and Apples, Neil reimagined Snow White's story, including her sexually abusing her stepmother and other people, because the story of Snow White wasn't sexually questionable enough as is. Thanks, Neil! Though the themes of sexual violence are not consistent in all of Neil's work, there are enough of these themes to bring me to the following conclusion. Neil understands that there can be power imbalances involving sexual relations, and he knows that they're wrong. That said, we should just cancel all authors. Just cancel all books, everyone. We've done it. This is a great day for the literature of this country, most of which will be burned at the stake. No, of course we don't do that. Every author has some unconscious bias because every person has some unconscious bias. That's just how being people sharking works. So that excuses it then, right? There is no ethical consumption under capitalism, so we all have a free pass to consume whatever media we want, no matter the harmful things the author will do with our money. No, that's not it either. While there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, that doesn't mean you just get a free pass to consume whatever you want. If someone tells you, hey, if you give me your money, I'm gonna use it to buy a chance to kick a puppy. If you hear that and you immediately give them money, you are still contributing to the kicking of that puppy. Please do not kick any puppies. The question doesn't lie in whether or not it's okay socially for you to continue to enjoy the art of people like Neil Gaiman or J.K. Rowling who have used their accumulated power to do harmful things. Jo uses her money and power to cause harm on a systemic level to trans people through donations to anti-trans groups, and also the power of her significant social media presence to spread misinformation about trans people. And then there's Neil, using his money and power to groom and essay women who are either fans of his work or employees, and all while using an autism as an excuse for why it was okay for him to do it. The ethical consumption of the works of problematic writers lies in whether or not the artists are separate enough from the art for you to still feel like you can consume their content. And if it is separate enough for you to enjoy it still, how do you engage in that to balance out the parts that don't align with your moral values? For many of us, it's hard to consume the works of people who do things as terrible as Gaiman allegedly has, mainly because it's so hard to reconcile that something that brought us so much joy could have contributed to getting so much pain to someone else. We watched Coraline thinking that she was the innocence we all felt as children, not realizing that we, like her, may have been falling for the manipulation of the bedlam without knowing it. So we have to look into our morals and ask, if I continue to read this, to watch, does that violate my morals? And if it does, can I just sew the buttons onto my eyes and allow myself to be consumed by it? It's still complicated. Like I said before, I was a huge Harry Potter fan. I knew my Hogwarts house, Patronus, wand core, and everything. But over the last few years of coming to grips with how the text doesn't align with my morals, I've eliminated all of my Harry Potter memorabilia. All except for 2. I kept 2 Harry Potter books throughout my many times of moving, both incidents of being homeless, living out of my car, and moving across state lines. I still have these 2 Harry Potter books, and I will probably never get rid of them, because the bigoted aspects of the text are outweighed by the fact that they're also still the last gifts I have left from my grandpa, who passed away in 2016. I'm never going to get him back any more than I am ever going to sit down and reread these books. But I can keep these books because these items, as they are entirely separate from the text and the ideas presented by the bigot of an author who created them. For many people, that's going to be their Neil Gaiman books. For those who found comfort in the pages of Coraline, Sandman, Stardust, or even the history of Norse paganism, a book I literally gave someone 2 days before the allegations against Gaiman came out, that's forever going to be tainted now. Separating art from the artist and applying death of the author are complicated frameworks of textual analysis that don't have an official yes or no answer. They're honestly entirely subjective. And that's the point. It's not entirely on the artist or the viewer, it's a balance of both. And if you feel you can continue consuming Neil's content after this, that's fine. For many, the art is separate enough from the artist. For some of those people, it's going to be a point to consume the work of Neil Gaiman, because by consuming the work of someone who was #cancelled, you're a cool counterculture badass who's freed themselves from the woke mind virus. And let me just tell you, you're not. You're just another consumer. You are not unique. You are not a disruptor. You're just another consumer in the machine, same as all of us. And for those for whom Neil Gaiman's work will forever be tainted, please don't feel wrong about that. The accusations against him have nothing to do with you. You didn't cause this, and you had no part to play. You did nothing wrong by consuming art that spoke to you, and it was always his responsibility to be the man he had presented himself to be to his fans. It wasn't your responsibility to expect what you couldn't predict. You are not to be held accountable for the actions of someone you don't know. And just remember, you deserve better. We all did. Hey there! So, today's Patreon shoutout is Zombie Agogo, one of the inspirations behind this video. Thank you so much, Zombie, for the many pictures you put out in our group chat and your thoughtful discussion about this subject. I hope that this video has brought you some sort of understanding, or at least a little bit of peace with such a complex subject. You're a fantastic patron, and I am happy to have you in our community. For those not in the community, please check it out and give yourself a shot to be our next Patreon shoutout. I hope to see you all in the next video.